There was a time when buying a PC game meant walking into a store, finding a giant box on a shelf, paying for it, taking it home, putting a disc into your computer, installing the game, and then somehow hoping it actually worked. And if the developer released a patch, that was your problem. You had to find it, download it, install it, and hope you had the right version. Today, that sounds ridiculous. You open your computer, click on a game, and Steam can download it, install it, update it, keep it in your library, connect you with your friends, show you reviews, recommend something else to play, and even let you install community-made content. But Steam wasn't born as the giant PC gaming store we know today. In fact, the original idea was much less exciting. Valve needed a better way to update its games, and that tiny problem would eventually change how PC games were distributed forever. In the early 2000s, Valve was already one of the biggest names in PC gaming thanks to Half-Life and Counter-Strike, but online gaming created a problem that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Games constantly needed updates. Bugs had to be fixed, cheating had to be fought, multiplayer systems had to be changed, and players needed to be running compatible versions of the same game. With physical PC games, however, the copy sitting on your desk didn't magically change when the developer released a patch. Valve could make an update, but getting every player to install it was another story. So Valve began developing a system that could automatically deliver updates and manage its games over the internet. That system became Steam, which launched in 2003. And this is where the story gets interesting, because if you imagine Steam appearing in 2003 as the polished digital marketplace we know today, you're imagining the wrong thing. Steam initially existed primarily as a way for Valve to deliver updates and manage its online games. For players, though, that didn't necessarily feel like progress. Imagine buying a game and then being told that you also needed to install a separate online program before you could properly use it. Internet connections were slower, digital downloads were far less normal, and the idea of having your games connected to an online account wasn't nearly as comfortable as it is today. Steam had a problem. Valve had built something it desperately needed, but players weren't necessarily asking for it. Then Valve had to make a decision that would change everything. What if Steam wasn't just something that updated games? What if it became the system through which Valve delivered them? And Valve had the perfect game to force that experiment into the real world: Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 was one of the most anticipated PC games ever made at the time, and when it finally released on November 16, 2004, Steam was part of the experience. Even people who bought the physical retail version had to interact with Valve's online system for activation and updates. That was a controversial move, and for players who simply wanted to install a game from a disc and play, Steam could feel like an unnecessary obstacle. But Valve had just achieved something incredibly important. Millions of players now had a reason to create Steam accounts and install the client. And once Steam was sitting on their computers, Valve no longer had to rely entirely on a physical retailer to reach its customers. Think about what that meant. In the old world, a developer made a game, a publisher produced physical copies, a retailer put those copies on a shelf, and the relationship between the player and the developer was separated by layers of middlemen. Steam could eventually collapse much of that distance. Valve could deliver updates directly. It could communicate with players directly. It could distribute games directly. And eventually it could sell games directly. But Valve didn't stop at its own games. In October 2005, Ragdoll Kung Fu became the first non-Valve game released through Steam, proving that the platform could become more than a delivery system for Valve's own catalog. And that was the moment the idea started changing. Steam didn't have to be Valve's launcher, it could become a platform. A physical store has a very obvious limitation: shelves. A shop can only display so many games, and retailers have to decide which products deserve that limited space. Digital distribution doesn't work that way. Steam could potentially hold an enormous catalog without needing to physically manufacture and ship another box for every copy. Suddenly, a small developer didn't necessarily need to win shelf space in a store to reach PC players. The game could exist online and players could discover it from anywhere. Of course, this didn't magically make every indie game successful. Getting noticed was still incredibly difficult. But the basic problem had changed. Distribution was becoming easier, and Steam was becoming one of the most important bridges between developers and players. Then Valve began adding something even more powerful: reasons to stay on Steam after buying a game. Your library could live in one place. Friends could be connected through the platform. Achievements could track what you had done. The Steam overlay could bring platform features into games. Cloud saves could make your saves less tied to one computer. Community pages could surround games with discussions, guides, screenshots, and reviews. Steam was slowly becoming less like a digital shelf and more like an entire ecosystem built around PC gaming. And then came one of the most important ideas in Steam's history: letting the community help decide what games deserved attention. In 2012, Valve launched Steam Greenlight, allowing developers to submit games while the Steam community voted and provided feedback on which projects they wanted to see released through the platform. Greenlight wasn't permanent. It was eventually retired in 2017 and replaced by Steam Direct, but it represented a major shift in the relationship between developers, players, and the store. Steam was no longer simply deciding what to distribute. It was experimenting with the idea that its own community could help determine what belonged there. And that mattered because PC gaming was entering an era where the number of games available to players was exploding. The old problem had been, how do I get a game into a store? The new problem became, how do I get anyone to notice my game? Steam had solved one problem and accidentally created another. But Valve had another trick up its sleeve. Steam didn't just need to help people find games, it could make people want to buy games they weren't even planning to buy. Enter the Steam sale. At first, discounts might sound like a simple retail tactic, but digital stores could do something physical stores struggled to do at the same scale and frequency. Constantly change prices, feature different games, run enormous promotions, and turn the store itself into an event. Steam sales became famous for making players look at a game they had ignored for months and suddenly think, wait, it's 75% off. And then another game appeared, and suddenly the player wasn't just shopping for the game they originally wanted. They were browsing, discovering, comparing, building a wishlist, waiting for discounts, buying games because they were cheap enough to feel impossible to refuse. The store had become entertainment. And this is where Steam's influence becomes much bigger than simply selling digital copies. Steam helped normalize the idea that your PC game collection didn't have to exist as a pile of boxes sitting on a shelf. It could exist as an account. That sounds normal now, but it changed the psychology of buying games. Your library could keep growing without taking up physical space. You didn't need to search through a cupboard for a disc. You could install a game again, you could update it, you could see your achievement. You could see what your friends were playing. Your collection became something attached to your digital identity. And the more games you accumulated, the more valuable the platform itself became to you. Then Steam went even further. Valve began experimenting with early access, allowing players to buy and play games while they were still being developed, with the expectation that the game could change substantially as development continued. Instead of the traditional model where players waited for a finished product, early access could turn players into participants in the development process. Valve's own guidance emphasizes that early access is for games that are playable but still in development, meaning buyers are purchasing access to the current state of the game rather than simply pre-ordering a guaranteed finished product. That model became especially important for games that relied heavily on community feedback and long-term development, and now Steam wasn't merely changing how games were sold. It was influencing how some games were developed and how developers communicated with their audiences. A game could be updated repeatedly. Players could provide feedback. Communities could form around unfinished projects. A successful game could evolve for years instead of being a product that simply appeared on a shelf and was eventually forgotten. Steam was becoming infrastructure for an entire PC gaming ecosystem. But there was another feature that made the ecosystem even stronger: community-created content. PC gaming had always been famous for mods, but Steam could bring more of that activity closer to the platform itself. The workshop eventually gave supported games a way to connect players with community-created content, making it easier for players to discover and use modifications and creations. And suddenly, the platform wasn't just selling games made by professional studios. It was also helping players interact with things made by other players. A game could become more than the product originally shipped by its developer. It could become a platform for its own community. This is an important part of Steam's story because it reveals what Valve was really building. Steam wasn't winning simply because it had a big list of games. It was winning because every useful feature made the next feature more valuable. Your games were there so your friends could be there. Your friends were there so community features became useful. The community was there so reviews and guides became useful. The games were there so sales became powerful. The sales were there so your library grew. And the bigger your library became, the more important Steam became to you. It was a loop. Steam was turning from software you installed into a place where your entire PC gaming life could happen. And that is why the story of Steam isn't really the story of a digital storefront. It's the story of a platform becoming an ecosystem. Valve started with a problem: keeping games updated. Then it gained something more valuable: a direct connection to players. Then it opened that connection to other developers. Then it surrounded the games with communities, reviews, friends, achievements, mods, sales, discovery tools, and an enormous digital library. Each step made Steam more useful, and every increase in usefulness made the next step easier. And eventually, the platform became so large that its size itself became part of its power. Valve's own Steam statistics show the platform regularly reaching tens of millions of concurrent users. In late July 2026, Steam's official statistics recorded a peak above 38 million concurrent users over a 48-hour period. But here's the strangest part: Valve didn't start Steam because it knew the future of PC gaming. It started because it had a practical problem that needed solving. There was no guarantee that the players who hated Steam in 2003 would eventually depend on it. There was no guarantee that digital distribution would become the dominant way people bought PC games. And there certainly wasn't a guarantee that a platform originally designed around updating Valve's games would eventually become a marketplace used by thousands of creators and publishers. Steam grew because Valve kept solving the next problem. First, it solved updates. then distribution. Then purchasing, then discovery, then community, then user-generated content, then ongoing development, and somewhere along the way, Steam stopped feeling like an application you needed to launch and started feeling like the place your PC games lived. That's why the most important thing Steam changed wasn't the shape of a game box or the way we downloaded a file. It changed what it meant to own a PC game collection. Before Steam, your collection was something you could physically point at. After Steam, it could be an account containing hundreds of games, connected to a community constantly changing, constantly expanding, and always one click away. And that is the real story of Steam. It didn't conquer PC gaming by replacing the game store with a website. It slowly removed the need for the old game store to exist in the first place. The box disappeared, the disc disappeared, the patch hunt disappeared, the shelf disappeared. And what was left was a library that wasn't sitting in your room anymore. It was sitting inside an ecosystem. So the next time you open Steam and see that familiar library of games, remember what you're actually looking at. You're not just looking at a store. You're looking at the result of more than 2 decades of Valve solving one problem after another, until the solution became something much bigger than the original problem. Steam began as a way to update games. It became the place where PC gaming happens,